is currently doing his doctoral work in Rome at the Pontifical Gregorian University, where Donna Orsuto is directing his dissertation. And it just gives us the confidence that the work that has been done by Jack and Kieran and Steve and so many others, that now the next generation is coming up, is stepping up to do that, and that the heritage continues. So without further ado, Father Emiel.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here. It's so amazing the last few days to listen to and to meet some people that I've looked up to for ages. Well, not ages. You're not that old. I have to say I like my title in the program there, because I often feel like an old war horse at 46 years old. So it's nice to be called a new scholar. But it's also a great joy to be with you all, because it's nice to be with family. It's really nice to be with family. And especially family that has, thank you all, family that in the last few days, knowing that I'm so nervous, that you've all prayed for me and given me some wonderful advice. So I hope I can use it today. Thank you. Now, as Patrick said, I'm in Rome and I'm doing my doctoral dissertation. And very often people ask me, what's it about? And so I give them the title. The title of my dissertation is Dignity in St. Teresa of Avila. And the response is normally, oh, fantastic. So how's the pasta over there? And actually, their response would be right, because the term dignity it's not a word that we use very often, and it's not an idea that we talk about in everyday language and in our everyday situations. In fact, some bioethics scholars would even propose that in terms of their discussions that they would dispense with that terminology altogether, because they say, well, it doesn't really have any meaning and it really has no scientific weight. However, I think that the theme has become very important to us in these recent weeks. In our immediate context right here, at the end of June 2015 in the United States, the concept of dignity has been raised in relation to questions of racial tensions and police treatment, of capital punishment and the ethics surrounding lethal injection, immigration, healthcare, and also recently the institution of marriage. And in terms of our faith, in the context of the Catholic Church, in his most recent encyclical, Pope Francis provided a theological, a moral, and a spiritual commentary on the state of the environment and its relationship with and impact on us, humanity. And the word itself, dignity, let's see if this works. Hello? There we go. The word itself appears 22 times in the Italian version of Laudato Si and 21 times in the English version. And it's based on, his ideas are based on this text from Genesis 1:26 to 28. The whole idea that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and that we are given the responsibility, the stewardship over all of creation. Pope Francis follows that call of Vatican II to look at the signs of the times and try to interpret the action of God and the divine call to respond to the needs and challenges of his people. And in fact, Vatican II was going through similar things, no? It was in the midst of some huge things going on in the world in terms of social shifts and political changes, economic changes, and even technological ones. Imagine that at that time, for example, we were living the Cold War. And even within the church, we know that there were lots of shifts in terms of ecumenism, in terms of the role of the laity. So it's wonderful to see so many of you here. And also this desire to return to the sources. So with all of that going on, they also looked at human dignity So if you look at Gaudium et Spes, they defined human dignity as that person being made in the image and likeness of God, to be in relationship with God and with one another. So this idea, or this concept of human dignity, has in fact since then informed all of the ways in which we as church have responded to things from life issues to other situations or discussions on social justice. In all of these contexts, human dignity is connected to certain unalienable rights, freedoms, and respect. That means that we are to value and recognize the other person and to give them the opportunities to realize their fullest potential. Teresa also uses this context, but in spiritual terms. She uses the image and likeness of God as her starting point to the approach on the spiritual life. So if we look at the first mansions or the first dwelling places, she writes here, so the title or the description of the chapter is, discusses the beauty and dignity of our souls. And later on she writes down here, since this castle is a creature, and the difference therefore between it and God is the same as that between the Creator and his creature, his majesty in saying that the soul is made in his own image makes it almost impossible for us to understand the sublime dignity and beauty of the soul. So you see here, twice she uses that word, dignity. If we do a deeper investigation into Teresa's understanding of that term, we'll see that she reveals a very deep anthropological and theological vision of a relationship between us and God. So it's not just something that we have, a trait, a characteristic of being human. It's something much more dynamic. It's not a moral question, but a spiritual one. So in this study, what I'd like to do is present to you some of the results of my research. And so this is one of your works during this talk. Pay attention. But what I'd like you to do is think about some of the ideas that might come to mind as you're listening to the talk. Because I'm looking for ideas that can help me in my thesis, some directions. So I'd appreciate that very much. What I'd like to do specifically is to examine the significance of dignity in Teresa's pedagogy on prayer and how this impacts our internal processes. So I'm going to first look at that Genesis view of Imago Dei, made in the image and likeness of God. And then I'm going to look at the impact of Jesus Christ on human dignity, Christ as the fount and motivator of this dignity. And then finally, I'm going to look at the role of the person as the place where all of this dignifying takes place. The person as locus of dignifying encounter. So, first of all, Teresa's understanding of dignity, it didn't just come out of the blue. She didn't just have a locution and go, oh my gosh, I have dignity. What actually she may not have realized consciously was that her anthropology, her idea, was the result of being shaped by theological currents of the time. So yesterday you heard about the influence of the Jesuits on Teresa. Today you're going to hear about the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Who are the Franciscans over here? All right, so we got some OFM seculars. And do we have any Dominicans here? Okay, so anyway, in the name of Teresa, thank you, and we're happy that you're here. So one of the theological influences is St. Bonaventure, a good Franciscan, who later influenced her spiritual masters, Bernardino de Laredo and Francisco de Osuna. So Bonaventure develops an idea. So yesterday you heard Brian talking about Augustine's idea of how the human being is made. So we have this material body, but then we also have this immortal soul, this thing that's spiritual. So we're composed of this. Bonaventure takes this idea of the human person, and he shares the view that while all of creation bears this imprint of God, what he calls this vestigium of God. It's only the human person who reflects the divine. And he does this through his soul that's made up of these faculties of memory, intellect, and will. And that's kind of important because if you look at John of the Cross's writings, if you look at Teresa's writings, you'll come across these three words. They are not simply psychological characteristics. They are also the spiritual way of describing how the human person looks like God. So we have these three faculties. And because of this, we're designed to know God, right? And so the way of really reflecting this, or being the imago Dei, the image of God, is when these three faculties really focus wholly on God. It's kind of weird because when you look at Teresa's writings, she talks about it a different way. Bonaventure would say, focus, 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 focus. And Teresa instead says, sleep. And that's what she says, and that's what she means when she's talking about focusing. That these three faculties are so focused on God that they don't do anything but let God do. Another influence on Teresa in terms of this vision of Imago Dei is the great Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas has the same idea, this Augustinian idea of body and soul, but he kind of diverges a little bit from Bonaventure. He would say that the soul is made up of three souls, or what is better to say three powers. A vegetative, which is kind of your instincts, and then sensitive, which is a bit higher, and then your intellectual power, which is what makes us different from from animals and from the rest of creation. And also, we have this thing called acts. Acts. And acts are our ability to think, our intellect, and also our free will, our ability to will things. How does this reflect the divine? Well, Aquinas looks at God and he says, well, God is made up of three persons. There's the Father, then there's the Son who proceeds from the Father, then there's the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son. So God isn't static, but there's movement inside. And so it's the same with us. We have these traits, what we would call these three powers that make up our soul, but there's also this movement of intellect and will. So we move like God, as it were, inside. And because of this, because of our intellect, because of our free will, we have the ability to understand abstract concepts. I'm not so good at that. I like math. I'm not so good at philosophy. But we have this capacity. And one of the abstract ideas that we can understand is truth. We have the capacity to understand truth. And especially the most abstract concept, we have the capacity to understand the truth of God. God isn't empirical. God is, as it were, abstract. And so Aquinas says, to know God, image God, well, there are three ways of knowing God. So the first is through human reason, meaning I know that there is a God. I know that there's a God. That's about it. The second way, a higher way, is that we know God through grace, meaning that I know that there is a God and I love him and I know him, but I still like to sin. The third way, which he calls the way of the blessed, is where the human person is so focused on God that he knows God and loves God as he is. And so what that means then is that imaging God isn't just knowing, but entering into participation in the divine life. It's the life of grace, according to Aquinas. Okay? All right, so influenced by these theologians then, Teresa's spiritual masters developed this idea in a spiritual way. So the great, wonderful Bernardino de Laredo, for example, he believes that dignity is the capacity of the soul to know God, as we heard before. but also the capacity to contain God. So he writes here in the first book of Ascent of Mount Sion, "Our soul is therefore rational because it is capable of reason, and by natural reason that its creator gave it, it is made capable of God." So we know God. And each time that one does not allow himself to know and understand his dignity, he halts the knowledge and reverence he owes to God, and ceases to know the corruption and misery of his own miserable composition, and prides himself in his humiliation. We'll look at this later concept a little while on, that's self-knowledge. But this whole idea of knowing God and capable of God, Connie mentioned it yesterday, is capax Dei. Capax Dei, the capacity for God. Okay? But it's not just a knowing God capacity. When you think of capacity, you don't just think about one's ability to do stuff, right? You also can think of the capacity of a tank to carry 20 gallons or 30 gallons, right? This is also another way of looking at capax Dei. In fact, if you continue to read this first chapter, Loredo says, he says that the soul is like a receptacle for God. And it was created by the Creator so that God could fill it with blessings and graces, but also with himself. More than that, it isn't just that we get stuff in here, but that we can actually enjoy it. We can actually enjoy his blessings and graces, and we can actually enjoy God himself. So what happens then in this dynamic of imaging and being filled is that we empty ourselves, and you hear this very often in spiritual literature, right? You empty yourself so that God can fill it. And in terms of contemplation then, that means that we get rid of all the stuff that's earthly so that we can contemplate God even in his inaccessible divinity. That's what Bonaventure would say. Is that okay? All right. So understanding that, then we can move on to the great Dominicans. Yay. Luis de Granada is really kind of important to Teresa. She is consistently recommended by her for spiritual reading. So I would recommend that you, if you can, just take a look at some of his writings. And so in order to understand his concept of dignity, we have to know a little bit about him. So Luis de Granada, when he was a young Dominican, he wanted to go to the missions. He really, really wanted to go to the missions, but he was too smart. Father Steve, I don't know if you're too smart to be in Kenya, but that's right. But they said, no, you're too smart. We need you for other things. And so he stayed where he was. And he instead wrote writings with the scope of it being used for missionary work. So this whole concrete reality of Spain going to the New World and encountering these native peoples, they needed a new vision, a vision of salvation, a vision of peace and justice and the common good according to their terms, and a whole way of looking at the proclamation of the gospel that could touch every person. And so he looked at the Imago Dei as being universal, so not just Christians, but native peoples as well. And they could realize their dignity by conforming themselves with this image. And so he writes here, and we should understand in some way the dignity of our souls, which are purely spiritual substances like the angels. And this is very important. Remember what we were saying about how we have a body and then we have an immortal soul, and that immortal soul is like the divine. So it says here, substances like the angels. And so he goes on to say, and I think this is kind of fun, so we should not be frightened to see the variety and abundance of functions at work in our bodies. I don't want to know, as we'll discuss later. But this is interesting, because what God works in this macrocosmos of the world, he also does in the microcosmos that is man, His immediate instruments are these spirits. That means that man, both vital and animal, to make him more spiritual and more like it. So I think that's kind of interesting that the soul, this is its way of imaging God, is also mastering what are these vital and animal spirits in order to make them become more spiritual. Granada's works were used, as I said before, they were taken to the missions so that they could help for the conversion of people. Teresa had the same concern. So she wrote a letter to her brother Lorenzo, and she was complaining about all the different people that were causing problems in her reform, the people who she lived with and the people who were supporting her. And in this letter, she writes also about the native peoples. So she writes, "For what greatly grieves me is to see so many souls lost, and I am very anxious about those Indians. May the Lord give them light. There is so much misery here and over there that since I travel in many regions, etc., I don't know what to say except that we are worse than animals. We do not understand the great dignity of our soul, and we undervalue it with things as cheap as those of earth. May the Lord give us light." Now, in talking about dignity, I don't think she's referring directly to the Indians, but she's talking in general about how we don't appreciate how we are made and what we have. But the other part of this is that for her, being made in the image and likeness of God is just the starting point. It's not enough. What we need is Jesus Christ. Okay? So, while Teresa recognizes this basic dignity of our Imago Dei, it's the baptized Christian, according to her, that bears the fullness of this dignity. And that's why, as Connie quite rightly pointed out yesterday, the humanity of Christ is central to her spirituality. And we see this, she talks about this in her life. She says, "I'd been so devoted all my life to Christ, and thus I always returned to my custom of rejoicing in this Lord, especially when I received communion. I wanted to keep ever before my eyes a painting or image of him, since I was unable to keep him as engraved in my soul as I desired." Throughout her whole life, the Incarnation served as a milestone at certain points in her interior journey. Why? Because it highlighted the concrete experience of the love of God. Now, in order to understand why or how she had this fidelity, we're going to look at some components of this relationship. So the first thing is the humanity of Christ. Why the humanity? Why not the divinity of Christ? If you read the spiritual reading, some other spiritual readings, they keep telling you, as you advance in the spiritual life, let go of earthly things. And in order to reach, as it were, the seventh mansions, their advice is, even let go of the earthly Christ. In fact, this is why Teresa stopped reading Osuna at a certain point. He was her master for 20 years, but when he said, you have to let go of the human Christ in order to reach the higher levels of spirituality, she said, no way. The human Christ is important. Why? Because in Christ's coming as man, he reveals God as triune, meaning that God is in relationship. And we, being made in the image and likeness of God, are also made for and in relationship. In this whole new, in his death and resurrection, Christ, as we know, bestows on us this whole new status as children of God. And not just that we're in relationship with him. And also, Christ provides us with the model for how to be a human being in relationship with God. So understand that means for her that the Genesis view of Imago Dei is incomplete. Imago Dei is, for her, incomplete. The reality is that that's because of the sinful condition of humanity, that in doing that we lost it, right? We know this from our catechism, from our studies in theology. Like Granada says that the original sin of Adam and Eve caused human beings to lose this capacity to reflect God, to be an image and likeness, and lose their dignity. And that made them prone to sin. The reason why I mention that is because we can now not say that dignity is just something that we have as human beings. You can actually lose it. You can actually lose it. What Christ does isn't just give us back that dignity, but he makes it something more, because he gives us, as I've said before, this participation in the divine life. So this whole new life, this is how Granada would describe it. He would say, fortunately, the Father took us as his children, and the Son for brothers, and the Holy Spirit for his living temples and shrines. Thus, what greater glory, what greater dignity is there than this? So we don't just reflect God, but we are in relationship with him. Now, amongst all the things, the events that happened in Christ's life, the most important event, according to Teresa's spiritual masters, is the Passion. Because according to them, it's the unequivocal declaration of God's love and his redeeming action. Loreto, in fact, says in the title for Book 2, Chapter 31, representing the ineffable dignity of the cross, the way we must worship and revere the cross. So understand that the cross is central to the spiritual life. And why is that? Because when we think about the cross, we recognize that God did something. God did something. I don't need to tell you that. You already know. But when we adore, when we reverence, as Loreto says, when we remember this salvific action, it encourages us to do two things. The first is to give God everything in our lives, whether it's struggles or difficulties or challenges or even blessings, to Christ who loves us. And the other thing is that we remember how we didn't honor it and our limitations. And this is how we enter into the spiritual life. So it's enough to look at, for example, the Ignatian exercises. That's a starting point. So the cross is central to our spirituality. The cross is the first or the initial point for entering into a real spiritual life. And so, as an example, all we have to do is remember, do you remember the story of her conversion, where she's in the oratory and all of a sudden she's looking at this image of the wounded Christ, and then she has this massive conversion? That's an example of how the crucified enters into, or helps us to enter into the spiritual life. And right here is the story here. Now, it's not enough to just remember. It's not enough just to remember what happened as part of our dignity. Another aspect of our dignity is to maintain this relationship, right? And so how do we do it as Catholic Christians? We do it through the sacraments. So sacraments are important. The sacraments are fundamental because, as we know from our baptism, we get baptized into a whole new life. We become priest, prophet, and king with Christ. We're part of the living body, his living body. And we also receive sustenance and identity. When we receive the Eucharist, we nourish our identity as people loved by God and in covenant. So Granada writes about this. Above all this, you have to consider that this most holy reformer of the world wanted to restore man to his former dignity and raise him up by grace as he had fallen by guilt. And therefore, to this end, he ordered the communion of his divine sacrament by which man becomes a partaker of God. And so he will not live the life of a man, but of God. So notice the role that dignity plays here in the sacraments. Right? So it's not just a philosophical idea, but it's something that we experience through the reception of the sacraments. Now, we receive the Eucharist and we're baptized, but there's still that old bugaboo that comes back, right? And that's sin. Sin. And Granada says that in the sacrament of reconciliation, as I mentioned before, when we sin, we lose our dignity. But it isn't just because we feel guilty, but it's also because, if you remember Father Fernando's homily on Monday, it's because we forgot to be thankful. We forgot to be thankful. So we lose our dignity because we forget also to be thankful. So when Christ restores that dignity through the sacrament of reconciliation, when the Holy Spirit restores this dignity, we are able to not only recuperate that dignity, but we're also able to further integrate our lives. Okay? So for Teresa, this sacrament offered the possibility of restoring that friendship in Christ as well, which is part of our dignity. Remember, I was talking about how dignity is also relationship, right? And so she writes very often. If you type in confession into a search engine on Teresa's writings, it comes up a lot. So, for example, she was writing a little note to her younger sister, Juana de Almada, and she said, "I beg you for the love of God and me to go to confession frequently." So she says, go to confession, go to confession. She knows what's important. She really knows what's important because she ends this little note with, "Send the turkeys since you have so many." So she knows what's important. All right, so we've looked at the image of God. We as the image of God. We've looked at ourselves as being in relationship to Christ, who gives us dignity. So now we're going to look at the person as the place where all of this stuff happens. Okay? Now, to help us to remember what we're talking about, we're going to go back to the quote that I had at the beginning, because this is really the foundation of Teresa's spiritual writings, right, in the interior castle. And here, I want to underline here the second part where we are a castle. Our souls are castles. All we have to do is think about that Bonaventure concept of capax Dei. We're made as vessels to know and love God. And because we're vessels, we have this space where all of this stuff takes place, the interior life. According to Teresa's teachers, progress in the spiritual life requires the soul's participation in this process of interiorization, and it has 3 pillars. The first is meditation on Christ, which we just talked about. So the first is meditation on Christ. So if you read any of Teresa's spiritual writers, they'll say, in order to participate in the spiritual life, you need to meditate on Christ. The second one, and the third one we'll talk about in a minute. The second one is transformation of the soul. All that stuff that takes place as we progress in the interior life. And the third is self-knowledge. Know yourself, self-knowledge. And these are the framework for our prayer. They should be. So in chapter 8, Teresa gives us that famous definition of prayer as the intimate sharing between friends, right? And taking time frequently to be alone with him. So the first thing to remember in terms of dignity and this space is that Christ is the initiator, Christ is the mediator, and Christ is the aim. Christ is the goal. And he does this by, as we know, calling us more and more into our interior, to our core where he resides. And when he does this, and when we participate in it, we receive dignity at each stage. This is another reason why I say that dignity is dynamic and not static. Why? Because, for example, when we look at the life, her autobiography, when she talks about the prayer of quiet in chapter 15, she says something very important about this stage. Think about Connie's talk yesterday. She says, "It is very important that the soul reaching this stage realize the dignity of its state and the great favor the Lord has bestowed on it, etc., etc. His goodness will make it a citizen of heaven, provided it doesn't stop through its own fault, and unhappy it will be if it turns back." So in writing this, she's saying dignity isn't just something that we have, but it's also something that we receive at this particular stage of prayer. So there's a metamorphosis going on inside of us. And in this second stage, she talks about it being dignity, because when we remember what's happening in the prayer of quiet, we're not doing a whole lot inside except saying, yes, God, I accept what you're going to send me. And so this dignity is God saying, okay, I'm sending you, I'm giving you these things. What the soul does is detaches itself from earthly things so that it can be more ready to live this life of virtue that it's already trying to live, and to look like more and more like the Lord. Okay? Later on, in the fourth stage of prayer, she uses the same word. She describes that chapter, discusses the fourth degree of prayer, begins to offer an excellent explanation, she's not modest, an excellent explanation of the great dignity the Lord bestows upon the soul in this state. So even here, she's saying, this is another kind of dignity, a dignity that was different from the second stage of prayer. And here in this fourth stage, remember that she's talking about the union of the soul. And this is where the soul recognizes that God is abiding in her. So before, if you think about it, if you remember your readings, those who have read it, when things happen, when she has experiences in prayer of God, it's always, I recognize God, and then I don't feel him anymore. He seems to be gone. They're fleeting experiences of the presence, of recognizing the presence of God. In this fourth stage, the dignity is the fact that the soul recognizes an absolute transcendental truth, that God is abiding in her. Fundamental to this, then, that is, to know that God is there, means to also know yourself. Yourself. So as I said before, there are three pillars, right? So it's meditation on God, transformation of the soul. The third pillar is self-knowledge, and that's what we're going to look at right now. It's the starting point for union, for reaching union with God. It's the beginning and ending of every prayer. So when we pray, we exercise this activity of knowing ourselves, because in doing that, then we can know how to conform ourselves more and more to the Lord. And we can understand that in two senses. First, psychologically, when we know ourselves, we have the ability to freely choose. Then we also, in freely choosing, can establish our identity. We can establish who we are. And then, having established who we are, we can determine the value of things. What are the things that are important to me? What are the things that give meaning to my life? And then, having determined these values, we can also measure them and say, okay, this one, yes, this one is still worth my time. This one is not worth my time. If you notice, we're kind of leaning more and more towards Father Stephen's talk from this morning, that whole question of enculturation, but from a different perspective. Then another sense besides psychological is spiritual. So when we are spiritually aware of ourselves, we recognize who we are before God. That means people who are blessed, people who have received graces, but also people who can sin, who have limitations. Then spiritually, when we know ourselves, we understand what God did for and does for us, and how much we owe him because of that. Just as a silly example, I don't like to cry. I really hate to cry in public. But whenever I get to Good Friday and the church is really quiet and I do the procession and I'm lying down there on the floor, that point really makes me cry, because I think about, oh my gosh, today we're celebrating something that God did for me and for us. And I think about myself, and I think about, oh my gosh, this is what I did, these are my blessings, this is the terrible stuff, and in all of that, God did something for me. So this is why self-knowledge is important. And then self-knowledge is important because when we know ourselves, then we can know what are the means that we need and the things that we also need to get rid of in order to advance in contemplation, to be available to contemplation. For example, this is an example, a silly example. Another silly example is, I'm not a huge fan of speaking in tongues, so I try not to do it. No, but one time I went to this prayer service, and it was really beautiful. It was a mass, and we were there praying, and all of a sudden we had the homily. The priest gave the homily. He sat down, and they started going, "Lu, lu, 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 lu," and then everybody else in the room started going, "Lu, lu, 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 lu," and I was sitting there thinking, well, nothing's happening to me. What's going on? And it was this realization that for me, it was, I don't need this. But for them, it's okay. It's nice and it's okay. But I don't need this, and that's okay. And that helps me with my contemplation, my availability to God. For them, it's the knowledge that for them at that point in time in their life, they need that. So when we know ourselves, we can avail ourselves of these means that can help us in our prayer. Okay? So Teresa obviously advises this. It's very important for any soul that practices prayer, whether little or much, not to hold itself back and stay in one corner. Let it walk through these dwelling places which are up above, down below, and to the sides, since God has given it such great dignity. That's right. Don't force it to stay a long time in one room alone. Oh, but if it is in the room of self-knowledge, how necessary this room is. See that you understand me. Even for those whom the Lord has brought into the very dwelling place where he abides. Now, I know that some of you have never read Teresa of Avila, so just to give you a context, remember that we're talking about the soul as a castle, and the castle has all of these rooms. And all of these rooms represent the different aspects of our personality, as it were. And so Teresa is saying, walk around, know who you are, but especially that place where you are revealed to yourself. I was talking to somebody here yesterday, and we were saying how scary it is to know yourself, but how essential it is for the life of prayer and relationship with Christ. In fact, Teresa calls this the backbone of, she doesn't call it, but it is the backbone of the spiritual life. Now, if you were thinking about dignity, right? So I've talked about dignity, about being in the image and likeness of God and all that sort of thing. If we just think about dignity in general, you might notice that there's something missing in my talk so far. And that's the question of freedom. Freedom. What role does freedom play? Because, for example, if we look at any discussion on human dignity, freedom is always something that comes up. If you look at the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, 31 articles talk about freedoms of the human person. If you look at medical ethics, for example, all of the arguments talk about patients' rights to information, their right to choose, and even the right to choose the sound treatment for their ailments. And if we look at law, all of the arguments surrounding dignity can be summed up in the right to self-determination, freedom, choice. So freedom isn't just a right, but it's a fundamental component of dignity, because it regards our ability to choose higher values, to choose the things that are really good for us. And it's important to make that distinction, because sometimes when we listen to the discussions on freedom and rights in our, for example, on TV today, when we watch the debates, it's all about, well, I can do what I want, right? Teresa wouldn't go along with that. In fact, I find this quite nice. So she's writing about people in community, and she's talking about melancholy, right? And she writes this: nowadays the term is used more than usual, and it happens that all self-will and freedom go by the name melancholy. Thus I have thought that in these houses, and indeed in all religious houses, this term should not be uttered. For the term seems to bring along with it freedom from any control. So she says, rather, the condition should be called a serious illness. And how truly it is one, and be cared for as such. So Teresa, when we think about freedom, she's saying, no. To do whatever you want, that's not freedom. It's not an absolute value in itself. It always has to be connected to truth. And this is why, in connection to self-knowledge, it's absolutely necessary. She writes, "Oh, how a soul suffers, God help me, by losing the freedom it should have in being itself, and what a torment it undergoes. I marvel now at how I could have lived in such great affliction. May God be praised who gave me the life to rise up from a death so deadly." So proper freedom is absolutely necessary, connected to truth, self-knowledge. And I would propose that this freedom includes the ability to construct an operative worldview founded on a framework of beliefs and priorities and ethics that allows for growth, change, and transformation. What am I talking about? So there's an author who's a doctor in Tel Aviv. His name is Michael Bar-Ilan. He calls it personal autonomy. And this is what he says, that personal autonomy is the ability for someone to develop and pursue a coherent, non-predatory, and rich life plan and a corresponding system of values. But in order to do that, he says, you need to have authentic self-reflection, so self-knowledge, and you also have to have sincere self-criticism. That means you can't just say everything that you believe is true, but also you need to have the sincerity to be able to do that. So it's all about truth. And the other thing he says is that in order to have personal autonomy, it has to be able to pass certain tests. 3 tests, he says: coherence, ontology, and plasticity. So in terms of coherence, he's saying that this system of values that you hold, it has to make sense. It has to be reasonable. There has to be some kind of logic to it. Secondly, in terms of ontology, he says that when you're creating this system of values, it can't be based on some delusions that you have. You know, when I think of delusions, I think about some of those people who go on America's Got Talent. And you're like, and they think they're the greatest thing in the world, and you're like, no. So it's kind of like that with the system of values. You have to have a truth. It has to be in itself true, ontologically. And then the final thing is plasticity, which means the absence of an overly rigid adherence to one's own beliefs. And we see that in Teresa's writings. She, as Stephen pointed out, she changes some things. She's not firmly held to one belief because she keeps it in check. She consults confessors and learned people in order to see if what she's believing and what she's following is correct or if it needs adjustments. Because when we do this, then, we can make appropriate choices and develop relationships that are in accord with it. Now, for Teresa, these experiences of freedom, this framework, is the Carmelite rule. The framework is the Carmelite rule, the immediate framework. But understand, I think Keith said it quite rightly yesterday, Teresa doesn't see the rule as an absolute in itself. It's not a fixed thing, but it's a guide. It's kind of like the Italians' approach to canon law. And it's true. It's a guide. It's the way that we look at it so that we can live our lives. And one example of this is the confessors, right? So Teresa says, I ask for the love of the Lord that this holy freedom be allowed by the one who is superior. May she always ask permission from the bishop or the provincial, that besides speaking with ordinary confessors, she and all the others might sometimes speak and discuss their souls with learned persons, especially if the confessors, however good, may not be learned. So there's space for individuals to be able to also pursue their own personal development, but within a framework. Because the framework is important. Otherwise, you have freedom without any control. Melancholy, as it were. So structure is necessary. Structure is necessary for the functioning of the community. Structure is necessary for the Christian spiritual life. But so is personal autonomy, because that way we learn to make good choices and we learn to know ourselves better. It's kind of like parents, you know the experience, right? You teach your kids how to do things, but then at a certain point you kind of step back and you let them do what they need to do. It's a similar sort of idea. You provide the structure, but then there's also space for them to discover their own identity and self. And when we can do that, then we also learn to transcend ourselves. We learn not only to know ourselves and be ourselves, but also to be beyond ourselves. And why do I say that? Because even with this structure of religious life, with this structure of the Carmelite reform, there's a bigger, what I call a superstructure, a super framework. And that is, as we keep returning to, the salvific humanity of Christ. The superstructure is the way, the truth, and the life. So this is important because when she talks about freedom, she uses it in a very particular way when speaking about the experience of God. She calls it libertad de espíritu, or the freedom of spirit. And so she writes here, if people wish to gain freedom of spirit and not be always troubled, let them begin by not being frightened by the cross. And they will see how the Lord also helps them carry it, and they will gain satisfaction and profit from everything. So Christ provides this superstructure in which she can discover herself. And in doing that, she integrates herself. And we who participate in the spiritual life integrate ourselves so that we can really live out this dignity that's modeled in Jesus on the cross. Are we okay? All right. So, conclusion. I think that Teresa offers a different perspective on dignity from what we're used to. So we're used to rights and laws. But she gives us, I think, a spiritual perspective that's firmly rooted in Christian tradition and personal experience of relationship and covenant. So to me, Teresian dignity is these three things: anthropological or human, theological, and also dynamic. So not static, not a trait. It's human because it's given to us. And all of these dignifying experiences take place within and through us, not just in the soul, but also in the body. The whole thing, the whole human person is involved. And it also requires our response. It's also human because it involves the incarnate Christ, Christ's humanity. But that's also why I say that dignity is also theological. It's theological because it's God who gives the dignity. It's God who is the source of it and the goal of dignity, because we image him, we become like him. And it's him who makes this relationship happen so that we could be instruments of him in the world. And finally, as I hope I showed, Teresian dignity is dynamic. So it isn't static, but it's engaging in this relationship of two subjects, man and God, waiting and responding again. Teresa, well, I'd like to end with this quote of Teresa's, where she says, "In sum, my sisters, what I conclude with is that we shouldn't build castles in the air. The Lord doesn't look so much at the greatness of our works as at the love with which they are done. And if we do what we can, His Majesty will enable us each day to do more and more, provided that we do not quickly tire." Our castle isn't a castle in the air. It's not airy-fairy. Our castle is our dignified soul that is designed to ultimately participate in divine life and assist God in conferring His dignity on all. Now, as Patrick said at the beginning, the director of my thesis is Dr. Orsuto, and she constantly reminds me to go back to the sources, read Teresa. And so, as a good student of Dr. Orsuto, I've got homework for you. And it's actually very simple. It's to read the first dwelling places of the interior castle, because that's kind of the foundation of this whole notion of dignity. And it talks about both aspects, about how we're made, but also about the impact of sin and also of Christ on our dignity. For those of you who've never read Teresa before, one chapter is not like a normal chapter. So normal chapter is like 20, 30 pages. Teresa's chapters are about 2 to 3, maybe 4 pages at the most. So it doesn't take a lot of time to read, but I think there's a lot of meat in the writing. Okay? So thank you everyone for listening. I appreciate it very much.